It began when my grandmother and I moved into an old duplex at the edge of town. I was 10 years old, a curious but restless child navigating the world in silence. My hearing was faint in my left ear, just enough to catch muffled noises, but it wasn't reliable. My grandmother, Margaret, was my rock, raising me after my parents vanished from my life. We moved into the upstairs unit, while her boyfriend, a quiet and peculiar man named Frank, took the apartment below. The building had charm, or so people said. It was quaint and cozy, with 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The kitchen had a door that led up to a small attic, which we barely gave a thought to at first. A single window in the attic overlooked the driveway, and at night it seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Margaret loved collecting antiques, and one of her prized possessions was a vintage radio. It didn't work, but she adored its old-world aesthetic and kept it prominently displayed on the kitchen table. I thought it was a bit creepy, with its cracked faceplate and dials frozen in time, but she said it gave the room character. A few weeks after settling in, something happened that sent shivers through me. I awoke to an intense sound, a loud, buzzing static that seemed to rattle my bones. Even with my limited hearing, I couldn't ignore it. Disoriented, I rubbed my eyes and stumbled into the hallway, finding Margaret already rushing ahead of me. The noise was coming from the kitchen. When we entered, the source became horrifyingly clear: the old radio. Its once dead face was lit with an eerie green glow, and it spat static like an angry serpent. Margaret's face turned pale. She twisted the dials, her hands shaking, but nothing changed. She signed to me frantically, "Unplug it." But when I checked, my heart skipped a beat. The radio wasn't plugged in. The sound ceased as abruptly as it had started, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. Margaret and I exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of us said much. She mumbled something about electrical interference, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Neither of us slept well that night. By Thanksgiving, we had mostly settled into the routine of our new life. Margaret decided it was time to decorate for Christmas, so we ventured into the attic to retrieve the decorations. The attic was cramped, with sloped ceilings and a single, grimy window that let in just enough light to cast ominous shadows. I'd never liked the space; it felt wrong, as if it were watching me. At the far end of the attic was a door, bolted shut with heavy iron latches. Margaret told me it led to a storage area the landlord had forbidden us from using. That explanation didn't ease my unease. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was on the other side of that door, waiting. A few days later, Margaret was at work and asked me to fetch something from the attic. I didn't want to go, but I forced myself, scolding my fear. When I reached the attic, my blood ran cold. The bolted door was now wide open, its gaping maw leading into darkness. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and I felt eyes boring into me from the shadows. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from behind the door. I didn't wait to see what caused it. I sprinted downstairs, slammed the attic door shut, and locked it. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat at the kitchen table, clutching my head and trying to calm down. Things only grew worse from there. Footsteps echoed in the hallway at night, heavy and deliberate. Banging on the walls became a nightly occurrence. I began waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, feeling as though unseen hands were pressing down on me. Margaret tried to reassure me, joking weakly that the ghost must know I was deaf and wanted to get my attention. Her humor didn't help. The bed-shaking episodes began soon after. I'd be yanked from my sleep as the mattress trembled violently, as if someone was trying to toss me out of it. One night, it was worse than ever. Across the room, I kept a shelf of glass dolls, relics from my childhood. As my bed shook, I heard a faint creak. Then, without warning, 3 of the dolls tumbled from the shelf and struck my face. The pain was sharp and immediate, bruises formed on my cheeks and forehead. That night, I couldn't hold back the tears. Margaret wasn't spared either. One morning, she came into the kitchen pale and trembling. She told me she'd been woken by a voice calling her nickname, the one her stepfather had used. He'd passed away years ago, yet she swore she could hear him clearly and even smell his old cologne mingling with the scent of coffee. It was becoming unbearable, and we both knew it. As the days turned to weeks, the house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I'd find objects moved from their places, like my books stacked in bizarre formations or the kitchen chairs turned upside down. Margaret tried to brush it off as my imagination, but I could see the growing fear in her eyes. She started leaving the radio unplugged and locked away in a cupboard, but that didn't stop its occasional bursts of static, now muted but still deeply unnerving. One particularly cold evening, I found myself alone in the house. Margaret had gone to visit Frank downstairs, leaving me to my own devices. I tried to distract myself with homework, but a sudden chill swept through the room, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. I glanced toward the kitchen and froze. The attic door, which I'd locked securely, was now ajar. The air felt heavy as I approached the door, each step dragging like I was walking through water. A faint whisper reached my ear, incomprehensible but unmistakably human. My heart raced. Steeling myself, I pushed the door closed and locked it again. As I turned away, the whispering stopped, replaced by the faint sound of laughter, low and sinister. That night, I barely slept. My bed felt like a raft adrift in an ocean of fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, set my nerves alight. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the attic door, wide open, and something standing just beyond it, something I couldn't see but could feel, its presence oppressive and vile. Margaret decided it was time to confront whatever was happening. She called a family friend, Mr. Davis, who claimed to have experience with the paranormal. I wasn't sure what to make of him. He was a wiry man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried the weight of conviction. He arrived armed with strange tools, a pendulum, a bundle of sage, and a camera with an old-fashioned flash. Spirits like to linger in places with strong memories, he said, pacing the living room. This house has seen something. We just need to figure out what. We followed him to the attic, where he began his ritual. The air grew colder as he lit the sage, the smoke curling like ghostly fingers. He waved the pendulum in slow, deliberate arcs, muttering words I couldn't understand. When he reached the bolted door, his face darkened. "This is the source," he said, motioning for us to stay back. He unlatched the bolts, and the door creaked open with a sound that made my stomach churn. Inside was a small, empty room, but the walls were covered in faint, childlike drawings. Stick figures, strange symbols, and handprints smeared in what looked like old rust. In the center of the room lay a single doll, its porcelain face cracked and eyes painted an unnatural black. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. I couldn't move, my legs rooted to the spot. Mr. Davis snapped a picture and stepped back, his expression grim. "You need to leave this place," he said. "Whatever happened here, it's not finished." Despite his warning, we stayed. Margaret insisted we couldn't afford to move again so soon, and I didn't have the heart to argue. But the house didn't take kindly to our defiance. The activity escalated to a terrifying crescendo. On the final night, I was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy dragging across the attic floor. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. Then came the banging, loud, frantic, and relentless, as if someone was trying to break through the ceiling. I screamed for Margaret, who burst into my room moments later, her face pale as a ghost. Together, we stood in the hallway, staring up at the attic door. The banging stopped, replaced by an ominous silence. Then, slowly, the door began to open on its own, revealing only darkness beyond. A low growl emanated from the shadows, sending us running down the stairs and out of the house without looking back. We stayed with Frank that night, and by morning, Margaret had called the landlord, demanding to terminate our lease. We packed our things hastily, leaving behind anything we couldn't carry. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house. In the attic window, I swore I saw a figure watching us, its outline sharp against the pale morning light. We never spoke of the house again, but the memories linger. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed longer. part of me thinks it's better not to know. The move to a new apartment brought temporary relief, but the events of the haunted attic haunted me. Even in a new environment, the memories clung to me like a second skin. I struggled to sleep, every creak of the floor or whisper of the wind pulling me back to that house and its terrible secrets. One evening, as I tried to settle into my new room, Margaret knocked gently on the door. She entered, holding a small box I didn't recognize. "I found this in the attic while we were packing," she said, placing it on my desk. "It's probably nothing, but I thought you should have it." The box was old, the wood weathered and splintering. Its latch was rusted but still functional. When I opened it, a chill ran down my spine. Inside were a few faded photographs, some brittle papers, and a small silver locket. The photos showed children, their faces blurred with time, standing in front of what appeared to be the duplex. The papers were written in a spidery scrawl, their language unfamiliar. The locket, however, seemed to radiate an inexplicable warmth. When I opened it, I found a tiny, faded picture of a girl with dark, piercing eyes. Her expression was solemn, almost accusing. "What is this?" I asked Margaret, but she shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "I found it in the attic behind the bolted door. Maybe it belonged to the family that lived there before us." Something about the locket unsettled me. That night, I dreamed of the girl from the photograph. She stood at the foot of my bed, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. When I tried to speak, she raised a hand, silencing me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Still, I understood her. "You shouldn't have taken it." Part 9, Unfinished Business. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and the air felt heavier. I told Margaret about the dream, but she dismissed it as stress. Deep down, I knew better. The house hadn't let us go, it had simply followed us. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to investigate the box further. The photographs revealed little at first glance, but one detail caught my attention: the attic window. In every photo, the attic window was visible, and in each one, there was a shadowy figure standing behind the glass. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. Someone or something had been watching us long before we noticed. I turned to the brittle papers next. They appeared to be letters, though they were written in an unfamiliar language. Determined to uncover their secrets, I took them to my history teacher, Mr. Turner, who had a knack for deciphering old texts. When he saw the papers, his face turned pale. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "They're from a box we found in our old attic," I explained. "Do you know what they say?" He hesitated before answering. "They're written in Latin," he said. "They're prayers, or maybe incantations. It's hard to tell. Whoever wrote this was trying to summon something or keep something away." His words sent a shiver down my spine. The box wasn't just a collection of forgotten trinkets, it was a piece of the house's dark history, and now it was in my possession. That night, the dreams returned. This time, the girl from the locket wasn't alone. She stood with a group of shadowy figures, their faces obscured but their presence oppressive. They surrounded my bed, their whispers filling the room. I couldn't understand their words, but their intent was clear: they wanted something from me. When I woke, the locket was no longer on my desk. I found it on the floor, its chain broken, as if it had been ripped away in anger. The air in the room was icy, and my breath formed clouds as I exhaled. I knew then that the box's contents weren't just relics, they were anchors, tying me to whatever darkness plagued that house. Desperate, I decided to return to the duplex. Margaret protested, but I convinced her that we needed to put an end to whatever this was. We arrived at the house under the cover of night, armed with nothing but a flashlight and the box. The current tenants had already moved out, claiming the place was unlivable. Inside, the air was thick with a suffocating energy. Every step echoed unnaturally, as if the house were amplifying the sound. We climbed the stairs to the attic, where the bolted door stood open once more. The room beyond was as we had left it, but the drawings on the walls seemed darker, more pronounced. The doll in the center of the room was now facing the doorway, its cracked face a mocking grin. Placing the box on the floor, I whispered a silent apology and backed away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a gust of wind swept through the attic, extinguishing the flashlight and plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, I heard the girl's voice, clear and cold, "You can't escape." Margaret grabbed my hand, and we ran. The house seemed to close in around us, the walls groaning as if alive. We burst through the front door, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until we were safely in the car. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The attic window was dark, but I could feel eyes watching us, the weight of their gaze following us into the night. Even after returning home, the sense of being watched never left me. Margaret tried to act as though the ordeal was over, but her sleepless nights betrayed her. I knew we couldn't keep living this way, constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for the shadows to catch up. Something had to be done. I revisited Mr. Turner with the photographs and the story of our return to the attic. He listened intently, his face growing graver with every word. "You need to rid yourself of the box and its contents," he said firmly. "Burn it if you can, but do it in a place far from here. These objects are conduits, as long as you have them, you're tethered to that presence." The idea terrified me. What if destroying the box angered whatever was haunting us? But the alternative, living in fear forever, was worse. Margaret agreed reluctantly, and we decided to make the journey to an isolated clearing on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would stumble upon the remains of our past. The night we chose was moonless, the sky an expanse of ink dotted with faint stars. Margaret and I drove in silence, the box resting between us like a ticking bomb. When we reached the clearing, I carried it to the center of a circle of stones we had prepared earlier. I hesitated before lighting the match. A part of me felt as though I were about to wake a sleeping giant. But Margaret's hand on my shoulder grounded me, and I struck the match, dropping it onto the pile of dry wood beneath the box. The flames caught quickly, licking hungrily at the aged wood. As the fire consumed the box, the air around us grew heavy. The stillness was oppressive, as if the world were holding its breath. Then came the screams, not loud, but faint and distant, as though carried on a phantom wind. The shadows around the clearing seemed to writhe, coalescing into forms that hovered at the edge of the firelight. My heart pounded, but I refused to look away. When the box finally collapsed into ashes, the figures dissolved into the night, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The air felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Margaret and I stood there for a long time, staring into the dying embers, before finally turning back to the car. In the weeks that followed, the oppressive energy that had clung to us began to dissipate. The dreams stopped, and the strange occurrences in our apartment ceased. For the first time in months, I felt as though I could breathe again. One day, as I was unpacking a box of books in my room, I found the locket from the attic. My stomach dropped. I was certain we had burned it along with everything else. Tentatively, I opened it. The picture of the girl was gone, replaced by a blank oval. The locket felt cold in my hand, but it didn't radiate the same malevolence as before. I showed it to Margaret, and she suggested we bury it, far away from the house. We chose a spot in the woods, marked it with a small stone, and left it behind. It felt like the final chapter of a story I never wanted to be a part of. Years later, I sometimes think back to that duplex and the events that unfolded there. The memories are like scars, faded but permanent. I've learned to live with the unease, the occasional shiver when a shadow moves just out of sight. Margaret and I never spoke of it again, as though silence could seal the past away. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to the faint scent of old cologne and coffee, and I wonder if the house ever truly let us go.